Riverton, Ohio, isn't the kind of place that rewards dreams. It's the kind of place that demands sweat. At 25, my life was measured in 12-hour increments and the rhythmic industrial hum of the frozen food plant. Every evening, while the rest of the world was winding down for dinner, I was lacing up steel-toe boots and tucking my hair into a net. I didn't do it because I loved the smell of freezer burn and industrial spices, or because I lacked ambition. I did it because when my father died, he left behind a mortgage that didn't care about our grief. My siblings, Marcus, the doctor, Elena, the creative director, and Chloe, the law student, saw the house as a childhood memory. To me, it was a debt I carried on my shoulders. While they moved to cities with glass skyscrapers and artisanal coffee shops, I stayed behind. I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on and the taxes were paid, but in my mother's eyes, I was merely a smudge on the family's polished reputation. I remember a family barbecue 2 years ago, the sun hot on the back of my neck. My aunt asked what I was up to, and before I could even mention the promotion I'd earned on the floor, my mother's laughter cut through the air like a blade. "Sarah's just helping out at a local place for now," she said, her voice dripping with a forced airy lightness. "She's taking some time to figure herself out." She couldn't even bring herself to say the word factory. Later, in the kitchen, she hissed at me while I was scrubbing potato salad off the plates. "Why can't you be more like your siblings? That job is embarrassing, Sarah. It's beneath us." I stood there with my hands in the soapy water, my back aching from a double shift the night before, and felt the familiar sting of being invisible. I was the engine that kept the family car running, yet they were ashamed of the grease on my hands. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that as long as they were safe and successful, I could handle being the embarrassing one. I believed that my sacrifice was a silent bond that held us together. I didn't realize yet that to my mother, I wasn't the foundation of the family. I was just the background noise she was waiting to turn off. I was a factory girl, a placeholder in my own life, waiting for a thank you that was never going to come. The silence that followed the successful kids only text was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Standing in the break room, the blue light of my phone's screen felt like a physical burn against my palm. My mother hadn't just forgotten to invite me. She had intentionally curated a celebration that required my absence to be perfect. My siblings had replied with heart emojis and dinner plans, their digital chatter flowing right past my name as if I were a ghost haunting the family thread. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a strange, cold click inside my chest, the sound of a lock turning. I looked down at my hands, stained with the gray dust of the factory floor, the hands that had quietly signed the checks that kept that very family home from being sold. At that moment, I realized I was paying to be insulted. I was subsidizing my own erasure. I walked over to the trash can and tossed my lukewarm coffee. Then I opened my contacts. My thumb hovered over my mother's name. For years, I had kept my phone on loud, even during sleep, terrified I'd miss an emergency call about the mortgage or her health. Now I felt a wave of dizzying freedom. I hit block. One by one, I did the same to Marcus and Chloe. I left Elena unblocked. Not because we were close, but because I wanted one window left open to see if any of them would actually notice I was gone. The shift ended at 6 a.m. Usually, I'd head straight home to sleep for 4 hours before waking up to handle my mother's errands. But as I walked to my rusted sedan, I didn't turn toward the house. I drove to the local community college and sat in the parking lot until the admissions office opened. When the woman behind the desk asked for my emergency contact, I paused. For the first time in 25 years, I didn't write Mom. I left the line blank. "It's just me," I told her, and the words didn't feel lonely. They felt like a foundation. As I walked out with a packet for the industrial engineering program, I realized that disappearing wasn't about running away. It was about finally standing still long enough to see myself. I was no longer the factory girl waiting for a seat at their table. I was a woman building a table of her own. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. The transition from the factory floor to the fluorescent-lit hallways of the technical college felt like stepping into a different dimension. My world had been defined by the heavy clank of machinery and the cold, unyielding air of the freezer units. Here the air smelled of floor wax and old textbooks, a scent that felt, for the first time in years, like a beginning rather than an end. I enrolled in the industrial engineering program, not to escape the work I knew but to master it. I wanted to be the one who designed the systems, not just the one who broke her back keeping them running. The first few weeks were a blur of exhaustion. I was still pulling night shifts, my eyes burning as I stared at calculus equations at 8 a.m., my fingers still stiff from the assembly line. I sat in the back of the lecture hall, instinctively trying to remain the background noise I had been for my mother. But the silence I had cultivated was interrupted by Mia. Mia sat next to me in systems optimization. She was 34, a single mother with a laugh that could cut through the thickest tension and a set of grease-stained fingernails that matched my own. She didn't look at my steel-toe boots with disdain. She looked at them with recognition. "Shift work," she whispered one morning, noticing me stifling a yawn that felt like it would swallow me whole. I nodded, braced for the usual pity or the subtle, "oh," people gave when they realized I wasn't on the traditional path. Instead she slid a thermos toward me. "Drink it. It's the strong stuff. I just finished a double at the warehouse." In the weeks that followed, Mia became the mirror my family never was. We studied in the diner down the street, our table a chaotic spread of blueprints and coffee cups. She didn't care about shiny careers. She cared about efficiency, grit, and the quiet dignity of building something with your own hands. One night when I confessed why I was really there, about the text message, the erased dinner, and the mortgage I'd paid for people who didn't want me, she didn't tell me to forgive them. She didn't tell me it was my duty as a daughter. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Sarah, a foundation doesn't owe anything to the house that tries to crush it. You're the architect now." For the first time I felt the weight of my family's disdain lifting. I wasn't just a factory girl to Mia. I was a peer, a partner, and a friend. I was finding a chosen family in the most unlikely of places, realizing that blood might be thicker than water, but respect is the only thing that actually holds a life together. I was finally surrounded by people who saw my work not as an embarrassment, but as my greatest strength. 4 months of silence had a way of sharpening my senses. I had grown used to the quiet, to the absence of emergency texts that were actually just demands for grocery runs or mortgage payments. But that peace was punctured on a Tuesday afternoon when I rounded the corner of the college library and nearly collided with my sister, Lily. Lily was the law student, the one whose future was supposedly so bright it made my own life look like a shadow. Seeing her in my world, the world of grease-stained blueprints and technical manuals, felt like a glitch in the universe. She looked tired. Not the "I stayed up late studying" tired I was used to, but a weary, frayed exhaustion that made her expensive wool coat look like a costume. "Sarah," she whispered, her eyes widening as they swept over my textbooks. "You're actually here. Mom said you'd moved to the city to work as a waitress. She told everyone you were too ashamed to show your face in Riverton anymore." I felt a familiar spark of heat in my chest, but it didn't boil over. "I'm not a waitress, Lily. I'm becoming an engineer. And I'm not ashamed." Lily leaned against the brick wall, her shoulders sagging. "She's losing it, Sarah. Ever since you stopped answering, the house is falling apart. The bank sent a notice last week. Marcus and Chloe won't help. They say they have high-yield investments that can't be touched. And Mom, she just spends all day on Facebook posting old photos of us and telling people how successful we all are while the roof is literally leaking into the hallway." I looked at my sister and realized the cracks in the facade were wider than I had imagined. My mother's pride was a hungry ghost, consuming the very shiny children she used to belittle me. Lily wasn't here to congratulate me. She was here because the foundation I had provided, the one they all pretended didn't exist, had been pulled out from under them. "She told the neighbors you won the lottery and went on a world tour," Lily added with a hollow laugh. "She'd rather invent a fantasy where you're a millionaire than admit her factory girl was the only thing keeping her afloat." I didn't offer to help. I didn't ask for the balance on the mortgage. I simply zipped up my bag. For years I thought I was the one who needed them to see me. Standing there I realized it was the other way around. They needed me to be the invisible support so they could keep pretending they were flying. "I hope the roof gets fixed, Lily," I said softly. "But I'm busy building my own house now." As I walked away I didn't look back. The cracks in her world weren't mine to fill anymore. The meeting with Lily had left a bitter taste in my mouth, but it also provided the final spark of clarity I needed. For years, I had been a silent witness to my own life, allowing my mother to narrate my story as a series of failures and waitressing jobs. That night, sitting in the quiet corner of the college library with the blue light of my laptop reflecting in my safety glasses, I decided to take the narrative back. I didn't use my name. I didn't need the credit. I just needed the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own head. I titled the blog The Factory Receipt. My first post wasn't an angry rant. It was a line-item breakdown of a life lived in the margins. I wrote about the weight of a mortgage paid by 12-hour shifts. I wrote about the smell of industrial ammonia that never quite leaves your skin, and the way a Mother's Day text message can feel like a formal eviction notice from your own family. I described the successful kids' table and the invisible hands that kept it polished while being told they weren't clean enough to sit there. I hit publish and closed the lid, expecting the words to sink into the vast ocean of the internet. But when I woke up for my next shift, my phone was buzzing with a frequency I didn't recognize. By noon, the post had been shared 10,000 times. By the time I reached the factory gates, it was 50,000. People from all over the country, warehouse workers, cleaners, retail staff, and embarrassing children, began flooding the comments. They weren't just reading a story, they were seeing themselves. They talked about the class ceiling within their own families and the quiet dignity of blue-collar sacrifice. It was a digital uprising of the background noise. As the sun set over the Riverton water tower, I realized that the anonymous receipt had become a mirror. I was no longer just a girl in steel-toe boots. I was a voice for a silent army. The post was moving through hometown Facebook groups and local community boards, rippling closer and closer to the suburban bubble where my mother lived. I had spent my life protecting her from the reality of my work. Now, the reality was finding its own way home, and for the first time, I wasn't the one who had to be afraid of the truth. The digital world has a way of collapsing distance, and in a town like Riverton, the distance between an anonymous blog and a church pew is shorter than a heartbeat. I was sitting in the college cafeteria, nursing a lukewarm tea, when the notification light on my phone began to pulse with a frantic rhythmic intensity. I hadn't unblocked her, but I hadn't changed my number either. The notification wasn't a text. It was a transcription of a voicemail, the first one she had attempted to leave in months. The blog post had found its way into the Grace and Fellowship Facebook group. My mother's social sanctuary, the place where she traded stories of Marcus's surgical residencies and Chloe's law internships like currency, had become the site of her public undoing. Her friends, the women she had looked down upon while wearing her perfect mother mask, had recognized the details. The local place, the leaking roof, the daughter in steel-toe boots who didn't exist in her photos. I hit play on the message. Her voice didn't sound like the polished, airy tone she used for the neighbors. It was thin, jagged, and breathless. Sarah, pick up. I know you're seeing this. Mrs. Gable called me this morning. She asked me if I needed help with the mortgage. She asked if it was true about the Mother's Day dinner. How could you do this? How could you humiliate me like this after everything I've done for you? There was a pause, the sound of a heavy door slamming in the background. People are talking, Sarah. They're looking at me like I'm a monster. You've made us look like common trash. You need to take it down. Right now. Tell them it was a lie. Tell them you were just being dramatic. Everything I've done for you hit me like a physical weight, but for the first time it didn't crush me. I realized she wasn't asking how I was doing. She wasn't asking where I was living or if I was hungry. She was mourning her reputation, not her relationship with her daughter. The facade hadn't just cracked. It had shattered, and the person standing behind the glass was a stranger who only cared about the shards. I deleted the message without replying. The panic in her voice was the sound of a world built on lies finally meeting the light. I looked at the take it down command on my screen and felt a surge of cold, quiet power. I wasn't being dramatic, I was being documented. I put my phone face down on the table and went back to my blueprints. For the first time in my life, her embarrassment wasn't my burden to carry. It was hers alone. The digital ripples of the anonymous receipt eventually turned into a tide I couldn't ignore. When a local storytelling collective reached out, asking the author of the viral blog to speak at their Voices of the Valley event, my first instinct was to retreat. I was a technician, a student, a worker, not a performer. But then I thought of the voicemail, the common trash comment, and the years of being silenced by a mother who was more afraid of my boots than she was of losing her daughter. I realized that anonymity was a shield, but the stage was a weapon. The night of the event, the community center was packed. The air was thick with the scent of rain and damp coats, a humble contrast to the sterile high-end venues my siblings frequented. I stood backstage, my hands trembling against the fabric of my work uniform. I hadn't dressed up. I wanted them to see the person who had been erased. When I stepped into the spotlight, the room went silent. I didn't see a crowd of strangers. I saw a room full of people like Mia. People who knew the weight of a double shift and the sting of being looked down upon by the very people they supported. I didn't read from a script. I told them about the night I paid the mortgage with overtime pay while my mother was out at a fundraiser, telling her friends I was finding myself. I told them about the Mother's Day text that's successful kids only dinner, and the moment I realized that being successful isn't about the title on your business card, but the integrity in your spine. For years I let someone else write my story, I said, my voice finally steady. I let them tell me that my work was a failure because it didn't look like theirs. But tonight I'm claiming the title they gave me. If being a factory girl means being the one who shows up when things get hard, the one who carries the weight others refuse to touch, then I am proud to be exactly who I am. The applause wasn't polite, it was a roar. It was the sound of 1,000 people who had been made to feel small finally standing up. As I walked off that stage, the ghost of my mother's disapproval, the one that had lived in my head for 25 years, finally vanished. I wasn't waiting for her to understand me anymore. I had found my voice, and in doing so I had found my freedom. I wasn't just Sarah Hayes, the background noise. I was the narrator of my own life, and the story was just beginning. 5 years had passed since I last stood on that stage, and in that time, I had traded my assembly line shifts for a lead position in a logistics firm 3 towns over. I had my own apartment, a savings account that didn't belong to anyone else, and a peace of mind that felt like a permanent sunrise. But the past has a way of finding you, usually when it's run out of other options. The call came through a local hospital's social worker. My mother had suffered a minor stroke, followed by a major financial collapse. The shiny life she had curated for my siblings had finally folded under the weight of reality. Marcus was embroiled in a costly malpractice suit, and Chloe's high-fashion lifestyle had left her with more debt than assets. Neither of them was willing to sell their luxury cars to fix a roof in Riverton. I went to the hospital not out of duty but for closure. Walking into the room, I didn't see the woman who had hissed at me at barbecues. I saw a frail stranger in a thin gown, surrounded by the beeping machinery that I now understood better than she ever would. "Sarah," she rasped, her eyes darting to my clothes. I wasn't in a hairnet anymore, but I wasn't in the designer silk she'd always craved either. "The house. They're going to take the house. I told the bank my daughter is a big executive now. You have to tell them. You have to sign the papers." There was no, "I'm sorry." No, "I watched your speech." There was only the old, familiar demand. She wanted me to be the factory girl, one last time. The invisible engine that hummed in the basement so she could keep her seat in the parlor. She was still trying to trade my hard-earned stability for her social standing. "The doctor said I need full-time care, Sarah," she continued, her voice gaining a manipulative edge. "You've always been so good at that. You're the only one who knows how to handle the heavy lifting. It's what you're built for, isn't it?" I looked at her and felt a profound sense of pity, but the old debt I used to feel was gone. She wasn't asking for her daughter. She was asking for a servant she didn't have to pay. The price of her pride had finally come due, and she expected me to foot the bill again. "I'm not the backup plan, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm not the one who fixes the things you break just so you can pretend they never shattered." I left her with the names of 3 reputable assisted living facilities and the contact info for a state-appointed financial guardian. As I walked out of the hospital, I realized that the hardest work I'd ever done wasn't at the factory. It was learning that I wasn't obligated to drown just because she refused to swim. Her pride was expensive, and I was finally finished paying for it. The drive back to my apartment was the most peaceful journey of my life. For the first time, I didn't feel the phantom weight of a phone call I was supposed to make or a crisis I was supposed to solve. I pulled over at the same scenic overlook where, years ago, I had sat in my rusted sedan and cried over a Mother's Day text. Below me, the factory lights twinkled like a grounded constellation. The place where I had once been erased was now the foundation of my independence. I took out my phone. I didn't want to leave things in a state of jagged panic, not for her sake but for mine. I unblocked my mother's number one last time to send a final message. "Mom," I wrote, "I've arranged for the social worker to handle the transition to the care facility. I wish you peace and healing, but I will not be coming back to Riverton to manage the house or your finances. I spent years being the person you were ashamed of while I kept your world from falling apart. I'm done being the secret foundation for a family that won't acknowledge I exist. I've finally realized that I don't need your stamp of approval to be successful. I already am. I hit send and felt a profound, quiet click. Not of a lock turning this time, but of a door finally closing. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't check for the 3 dots of a typing bubble. I simply deleted the thread and turned the phone off. I looked down at my hands. They were clean now, the grease of the factory floor replaced by the polished life of an engineer, but the strength in them was the same. My siblings had their degrees and their titles, and my mother had her hollow pride, but I had something they would never understand. A sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on anyone else's gaze. I am Sarah Hayes. I am a builder, a thinker, and a survivor. I still wear steel-toe boots when I visit a job site, and I still respect the grit it takes to keep the world running. But I no longer hear my mother's voice in my head every time I swipe my badge. I hear my own. The factory girl didn't disappear. She just grew up and realized that the only person she ever needed to impress was the woman looking back at her in the mirror. I started my car and drove toward my future, finally and completely free.